Marcus Sullivan stood at the crowded airport gate, his weathered hands gripping the worn leather briefcase containing his most treasured possessions. Medals earned in Vietnam that he was bringing to a special remembrance ceremony. Little did he know that his simple request to board would spark a chain of events that would change airline policy forever, all because of a casually dressed man in the corner who wasn't just another passenger, but the airline's CEO in disguise. The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport cast harsh shadows across Marcus Sullivan's face as he made his way through the crowded terminal, his silver hair reflecting the artificial glow above. At 78, every step was deliberate, measured by the steady tap of his wooden cane against the polished floor. His pressed navy blue suit, while immaculate, hung slightly loose on his frame, a reminder of the weight time had claimed. From his once robust build, the Marine Corps pin on his lapel caught occasional glints of light, much like the pride that still shone in his deep-set brown eyes. Those eyes had seen more than most could imagine, from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan, where he'd later served as a military advisor. But today, they were focused on Gate B-17, where Flight 2241 to Washington, D.C. awaited, a flight that would take him to Arlington National Cemetery for a ceremony honoring his fallen squadron. Marcus clutched his worn leather briefcase closer to his chest, feeling the weight of the medals inside. Each one told a story of sacrifice, of brothers lost in battle, of moments when courage meant the difference between life and death. The Distinguished Service Cross among them carried the heaviest weight of all, not for its metal content, but for the memories it held of a rescue mission that had saved 12 men, but cost him the full use of his right leg. The mourning crowd parted around him like water around a stone, most passengers, too, engrossed in their phones or travel concerns, to notice the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his boarding pass. A young mother with 2 children briefly paused, her eyes catching the pin on his lapel, and she offered a small smile of recognition. Marcus nodded back, his weathered face softening momentarily. As he approached the gate, the digital display above showed an on-time departure, but something in the gate agent's expression made Marcus's combat-honed instincts prickle with unease. The young woman behind the counter, her name tag reading Rachel Martinez, barely glanced up from her computer screen as he presented his boarding pass. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with the rapid-fire efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of such documents. But her brow furrowed in a way that Marcus had learned to recognize as trouble brewing. In the corner of the gate area, a man in his mid-40s sat seemingly absorbed in his laptop. His casual attire, jeans, a Stanford alumni hoodie, and well-worn running shoes blended perfectly with the business-casual crowd. But James Cooper, CEO of Summit Airlines, wasn't checking email or reviewing presentations. His keen grey eyes observed every interaction at his gate, part of his monthly undercover visits to various airports, a practice he'd instituted to understand the real customer experience his airline provided. Marcus stood patiently at the counter, one hand resting on his cane, while the other remained protectively near his briefcase. The morning sun, streaming through the terminal's massive windows, highlighted the small scars on his knuckles, testament to a life lived in service. Behind him, a line began to form, passengers shuffling impatiently as Rachel continued to frown. At her screen, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan," Rachel finally spoke, her voice carrying the rehearsed tone of customer service masking irritation. "But there seems to be an issue with your reservation. The system is showing your seat has been reassigned due to an aircraft change. We're currently operating at capacity, and I'm afraid we won't be able to accommodate you on this flight." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and unwelcome. Marcus's expression remained neutral, years of military discipline holding his disappointment in check. In the corner, James Cooper's fingers stilled over his laptop keyboard, his attention now fully focused on the unfolding scene. Part 2. Establishment of urgent or important goal destination for protagonist. This ceremony, Marcus began, his voice steady despite the growing tension, starts at 1800 hours tonight. It's a memorial service for the men I served with in Vietnam. There won't be another one. His words carried no trace of pleading, just the simple weight of truth. The briefcase in his hand seemed heavier now, laden with the responsibility of representing those who could no longer speak for themselves. The importance of his journey went far beyond a simple flight to Washington, D.C. In his briefcase, alongside his own medals, he carried a posthumously awarded Silver Star that belonged to his closest friend, Michael Torres. Michael's grandson would be at the ceremony, the first time any member of the Torres family would receive recognition for Michael's sacrifice. The medal had taken decades to be approved, layers of bureaucracy finally parting to acknowledge a hero's final act of courage. Rachel's expression flickered briefly, perhaps registering the gravity of Marcus's mission, before professional detachment reasserted itself. "I understand this is important to you, sir, but we have strict protocols for overbooked flights. I can try to get you on tomorrow morning's flight, though it would be on standby status." Behind Marcus, the line of passengers grew longer, their collective impatience creating a low buzz of murmured complaints. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his watch pointedly, while a young couple whispered to each other, casting uncomfortable glances at the scene unfolding before them. From his corner vantage point, James Cooper watched the interaction with growing concern. He'd seen enough airport operations to know that aircraft changes rarely resulted in complete loss of confirmed seats. Something wasn't adding up, and the CEO's instincts, honed through years of building Summit Airlines from a regional carrier to a major player in the industry, told him there was more to this situation than a simple overbooking. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a carefully folded letter. "This is from the Department of Veterans Affairs," he explained, his voice taking on a touch of urgency that hadn't been there before. "It confirms my participation in tonight's ceremony. I'm one of only 3 surviving members of our unit who can still travel. The others—" He paused, memories flickering behind his eyes. "The others won't be making any more journeys." The letter trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear or anger, but from the same injury that necessitated his cane. A fragment from an explosion in 1969 had left microscopic pieces of shrapnel in his right side, a constant reminder of the day he'd led his unit through an ambush to rescue a downed helicopter crew. The tremors were worse in the mornings, something the VA doctors said was common among aging veterans with similar injuries. Rachel glanced at the letter but didn't take it. "I apologize, Mr. Sullivan, but documentation about your destination doesn't change our current flight situation. Perhaps you should have arrived earlier to check in." Mine, the suggestion carried a hint of blame that made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably. Marcus had indeed arrived early, 3 hours before departure, following the habits of discipline ingrained by decades of military service. He'd watched the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold from the airport's vast windows, remembering similar dawns in different mountains half a world away. He'd chosen Summit Airlines specifically because their website advertised veteran-friendly policies and priority boarding for service members. In his corner, James Cooper quietly opened his tablet's browser, accessing Summit's internal booking system through a secure connection. His eyes narrowed as he reviewed the flight manifest. The system showed 3 first-class seats still available, held back for last-minute premium purchases, a practice he'd specifically ordered discontinued months ago. The growing tension at the gate drew more attention. An elderly woman sitting nearby removed her reading glasses, her face clouding with disapproval at Rachel's dismissive tone. A young man in army fatigues, waiting for a different flight, watched the scene with barely concealed anger, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Marcus straightened his shoulders, years of military bearing asserting themselves. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to commanding respect, "I understand you have procedures to follow, but I also understand the difference between cannot and will not. I'm asking you to recognize that difference." The morning sun now streamed fully through the terminal's windows, catching the Marine Corps pin on Marcus's lapel and the small POW MIA bracelet on his wrist, a memorial to another brother in arms who never made it home. The light seemed to emphasize the gravity of the moment, casting long shadows that stretched toward the gate like fingers of the past reaching into the present. Part 3. Introduction of initial conflict denial of service. Rachel's fingers darted. Across her keyboard again, the clicking sounds sharp against the background hum of airport noise. "Sir," she said, her voice taking on an edge of finality, "I've already explained that your seat was reassigned. There's nothing more I can do." She glanced meaningfully at the growing line behind Marcus, making it clear she considered the matter. Closed. Marcus remained still, his military bearing unchanged, but something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, but a deep disappointment that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He'd faced similar dismissals before, at VA hospitals, government offices, and various institutions where efficiency trumped humanity. Each time it stirred memories of returning home from Vietnam, when uniforms were more likely to draw scorn than respect. "Perhaps," Marcus suggested quietly, "you could check if any other passengers might be willing to take a later flight." His voice carried no demand, only a reasonable request born of necessity. The briefcase in his hand held not just medals but promises. Promises to fallen comrades that their sacrifices would be remembered, that their stories would be told. Rachel's response came with practiced dismissiveness. "That's not our policy for these situations, Mr. Sullivan. As I mentioned, I can try to get you on tomorrow's flight." She turned her attention to her computer screen, her body language suggesting, "The conversation was over. The next passenger in line, please." A young family behind Marcus shuffled uncomfortably, the father clutching boarding passes while trying to manage a squirming toddler. The mother caught Marcus's eye and offered an apologetic smile, as if embarrassed to be part of the crowd pushing him aside. Their daughter, no more than 7, stared at Marcus's Marine Corps pin with open curiosity. James Cooper, still observing from his corner position, noticed something that made his jaw tighten. Rachel had minimized the booking screen the moment Marcus mentioned checking other flights, a subtle movement that suggested she wasn't being entirely truthful about the options available. In his years of building Summit Airlines, Cooper had emphasized transparency above all else. Watching this interaction felt like watching the erosion of everything he'd worked to create. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the morning's long wait beginning to take its toll on his injured leg. The pain was familiar, a constant companion since that day in the jungle when he'd carried a wounded radioman through 3 miles of enemy territory. The memory of that burden was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility he carried now, representing his unit at what might be their final reunion. "Ma'am," Marcus tried one last time, his tone remaining respectful despite the growing discomfort, "I understand you have procedures, but surely there must be some alternative. This isn't just any flight. It's about honoring promises made half a century ago." Rachel's expression hardened. "Mr. Sullivan, if you continue to hold up the line, I'll have to call security. We can't make exceptions just because someone has a special event to attend." The words came out clipped and cold, carrying an implicit threat that seemed grossly disproportionate to Marcus's calm requests. The mention of security caused several nearby passengers to turn their heads. A businessman lowered his phone, frowning at Rachel's escalation. The young soldier in fatigues took a step forward, then thought better of it, his face reflecting a struggle between respect for authority and military brotherhood. In his corner, James Cooper closed his laptop with deliberate slowness. The situation had crossed a line he couldn't ignore. Not only was the gate agent's behavior contradicting Summit's stated policies, but it represented a fundamental failure of human decency. As CEO, he'd always believed that a company's true character showed in how it treated those who deserved the most respect. Marcus's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his cane, not in anger, but in resolution. He'd faced worse challenges than this, moments when survival depended on maintaining composure under pressure. The briefcase containing the medals seemed to pulse with the weight of memory. Nights in the jungle, when hope seemed as distant as the stars. Dawns that broke over. Fields of loss, and the unbreakable bonds forged in those dark hours. "Very well," Marcus said quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation being heaped upon him. "I'll step aside, but I want you to know that you're not just denying me a seat. You're denying the memory of men who gave everything for the freedoms we enjoy today, including the freedom to treat veterans with such disregard." Part 4. Introduction of the secret observer, undercover CEO becoming more involved. James Cooper rose from his seat, his casual attire allowing him to blend seamlessly with other travelers. 20 years ago, he'd started Summit Airlines with a single regional route and a promise to build an airline that treated people with dignity. Now, watching the scene unfold before him, he felt that promise cracking like thin ice under pressure. Moving closer to the gate desk, Cooper positioned himself within earshot while pretending to check flight information on a nearby monitor. His Stanford hoodie and worn jeans, chosen specifically for these undercover observations, made him invisible to his own staff. It was a technique he'd developed after realizing that formal boardroom reports often painted a very different picture than ground-level reality. The gate area had grown uncomfortably quiet, the usual airport cacophony muted by the tension of the unfolding scene. Marcus Sullivan stood to the side now, his military bearing unchanged despite the dismissal he'd just endured. The leather briefcase containing his medals rested against his leg, a silent witness to both past and present indignities. Cooper noticed details his employees had missed. The slight tremor in Marcus's right hand that spoke of old wounds, the carefully pressed suit that suggested this journey held deep importance, and most tellingly, the small ribbon on his lapel that marked him as a Distinguished Service Cross recipient, one of the nation's highest military honors. "Excuse me," Cooper said, stepping forward as if he were just another concerned passenger. "I couldn't help overhearing. Is there really no way to accommodate this gentleman?" His voice carried a casual authority that made Rachel glance up from her computer screen with slight irritation. "Sir, this is a private matter between the airline and Mr. Sullivan," Rachel replied, her tone clipped. "If you're not on this flight, I'll have to ask you to step away from the counter." Cooper maintained his role as a casual observer, but his keen eyes caught Rachel minimizing several screens on her computer. Screens he knew contained solutions to this very situation. As CEO, he'd implemented specific protocols for handling overbooked flights with clear priorities for military veterans and service members. "Actually," Cooper pressed, maintaining his everyday passenger demeanor, "I travel this route frequently, and I know for a fact that Summit Airlines has a policy regarding military veterans. Perhaps we should review that policy." He pulled out his phone, apparently searching for information that he'd written himself years ago. Rachel's expression tightened. "Sir, I'm quite familiar with our policies. As I explained to Mr. Sullivan, this is an issue of aircraft change and capacity. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other passengers to assist." She gestured to the growing line behind them, where travelers shifted uncomfortably, many avoiding eye contact with the scene unfolding before them. Marcus remained silent during this exchange, his dignity intact despite the mounting tension. His eyes, however, carried a familiar resignation, the look of someone who'd seen promises broken before, who'd learned to expect disappointment even from those who claimed to honor service and sacrifice. Cooper felt a deep disquiet settling in his chest. He'd started Summit Airlines after his own father, a Korean War veteran, had faced similar treatment at another airline. That memory had driven him to build something different, something better. Now, standing in his own terminal, he watched those ideals crumbling under the weight of bureaucratic indifference. The morning sun, streaming through the terminal windows, cast long shadows across the gate area, creating an almost theatrical scene. Marcus Sullivan, decorated veteran, standing aside with quiet dignity. Rachel, the gate agent, fortified behind her computer screen. And Cooper himself, the undercover CEO, watching his company's values being tested in real time. A young janitor pushed his cleaning cart past the scene, pausing briefly when he noticed Marcus's Marine Corps pin. The young man straightened instinctively, offering a respectful nod that spoke of his own military connection. It was a small gesture, but it highlighted the stark contrast between natural human respect and institutional coldness. Cooper glanced at his watch. The flight wouldn't board for another 20 minutes. There was time to address this situation, but he needed to decide how. Revealing his identity too soon might result in superficial compliance rather than genuine understanding. Yet every moment Marcus stood there, denied basic respect, felt like a betrayal of everything Summit Airlines was meant to represent. Part 5. First display of unfair treatment by authority figure escalates. "Mr. Sullivan," Rachel called out sharply, her voice cutting through the gate area's tense atmosphere, "if you and your advocate continue to disrupt the boarding process, I'll have no choice but to call security." She emphasized the word security while reaching for her desk phone, a clear escalation of her earlier threats. The morning, light filtering through the terminal's windows, cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting an expression that had moved from mere dismissiveness to active hostility. Her fingers hovered over the phone keypad, a gesture meant to intimidate rather than resolve the situation. Several passengers in line exchanged uncomfortable glances. A businessman in a charcoal suit lowered his Wall Street Journal, watching the scene with growing concern. Two flight attendants preparing for boarding at the neighboring gate paused their conversation, sensing the mounting tension. "I don't believe that will be necessary," Marcus responded, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced far worse threats than an overzealous gate agent. "But I would like to speak with your supervisor." His request was reasonable, measured, the antithesis of the disruption Rachel was claiming he caused. Rachel's laugh was short, sharp. "My supervisor will tell you exactly what I have. We're not obligated to accommodate every passenger who claims their journey is special." The emphasis on claims carried an undercurrent of disbelief that made several nearby passengers wince. James Cooper, still maintaining his cover as a concerned traveler, noticed Rachel's choice of words. Claims, as if a decorated veteran's service was something to be doubted, as if the medals in Marcus's briefcase were mere trinkets rather than symbols of sacrifice and courage. "Young lady," Marcus began, his tone remaining respectful despite the growing hostility directed at him, "I haven't claimed anything. My service record speaks for itself, as does my confirmed reservation on this flight." He reached into his jacket pocket, producing his military ID alongside his boarding pass. Rachel barely glanced at the documents. "Military ID doesn't guarantee you a seat, sir. Perhaps you should have considered paying for first class if this flight was so important." Her words dripped with condescension, suggesting that Marcus's Military service meant less than the ability to pay for premium seating. The young soldier in fatigues, who had been watching from nearby, clenched his fists at this latest slight. An elderly couple seated in the waiting area shook their heads in disapproval, the woman whispering something that made her husband nod grimly. Cooper noticed another detail that made his blood boil. Rachel had minimized a new screen on her computer. One he recognized as the Volunteer Compensation Offer system. It was a tool specifically designed for situations like this, allowing gate agents to request volunteers to take later flights in exchange for travel vouchers. She was deliberately avoiding solutions that could resolve the situation. "I did consider first class," Marcus replied, his dignity unwavering. "But when I booked, I was told my veteran status would guarantee priority boarding and seat assignment. That's why I chose Summit Airlines." His words carried no accusation, just a simple statement of facts that made Rachel's behavior seem even more egregious. Rachel's response was immediate and cutting. "Our policies are subject to change without notice. If you'd read the fine print on your ticket, you'd understand that." She turned to address the line of waiting passengers, raising her voice unnecessarily. "I apologize for the delay, everyone. We'll begin boarding as soon as we resolve this situation." The way she said "situation" transformed Marcus from a decorated veteran into an inconvenience, a disruption to be managed rather than a human being deserving of respect. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, caught between sympathy for Marcus and their own travel needs. Cooper watched as Rachel picked up her phone again, this time actually dialing. "Security, this is Gate B17. We have a passenger refusing to accept our boarding policies." She paused, listening. "No, he hasn't made any threats, but he's disrupting the boarding process." Another pause. "Yes, he's an elderly gentleman, claims to be a veteran." The word "claims" echoed through the gate area again, landing like a slap across Marcus's weathered face. Yet he remained standing tall, his military bearing a silent rebuke to the disrespect being shown to him. Part 6. Protagonist's graceful handling of unfair treatment. Marcus Sullivan's response to the escalating situation came from decades of discipline, forged in circumstances far more dire than an airport confrontation, rather than matching Rachel's. "Hostility?" He took a measured step back from the counter, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I apologize if I've caused any disruption," he announced, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby passengers without seeming confrontational. "That was never my intention." The simple dignity in his words made Rachel's call to security seem increasingly absurd. Two uniformed security officers approached from the terminal corridor, their pace unhurried as they assessed the scene. What they found hardly matched the reported disruption. An elderly veteran, standing quietly with his cane and briefcase, maintaining a respectful distance from the gate counter. The older of the two officers, a man with graying temples and a nameplate reading "Rodriguez," took in the scene with experienced eyes. His gaze lingered on Marcus's Marine Corps pin and the military precision of his stance. Rodriguez's hand moved unconsciously to his own collar, where a similar pin sat. Brotherhood recognized across generations. "Sir," Rodriguez addressed Marcus, his tone professional but notably more respectful than Rachel's had been, "could you explain what's happening here?" The question was open-ended, offering Marcus the chance to present his side without presumption of guilt. From his position nearby, James Cooper watched the interaction closely, noting how Marcus maintained his composure even as he had to explain his situation yet again. The CEO's hand tightened around his phone, where he could easily access proof of his identity and end this immediately. But something held him back, a need to see how his company's employees would handle this situation without the pressure of his presence. "Officer," Marcus began, his voice steady, I have a confirmed reservation for this flight to attend a memorial service at Arlington. When I arrived, I was informed my seat had been reassigned. I merely asked to explore alternatives." He gestured to his briefcase. "I'm carrying medals to be presented at the ceremony, including a posthumous award for a fallen comrade." Rodriguez glanced at his partner, then at Rachel, whose expression had shifted from triumphant to uncertain at Marcus's measured response. The second security officer, younger and initially more tense, relaxed his stance as he recognized the disparity between the reported disruption and the reality before them. "I understand procedures must be followed," Marcus continued, addressing both the officers and the gathered crowd with quiet authority. "I served for 30 years, following and giving orders, but I also learned that true leadership means finding solutions, not just enforcing rules." A murmur of agreement rippled through the watching passengers. The businessman with the Wall Street Journal had completely lowered his paper now, nodding slowly at Marcus's words. The young soldier in fatigues stood straighter, recognizing in Marcus is bearing the kind of leadership that training manuals tried to teach, but experience alone could perfect. James Cooper felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched. Pride in Marcus's dignity warred with shame at how his airline was treating this veteran. The contrast between Rachel's escalating hostility and Marcus's composed response highlighted exactly what was wrong with the situation. "I'll step aside again," Marcus offered, though he hadn't been asked to move. "Perhaps someone else can help me find an alternative route to Washington." His words carried no bitterness, no accusation, just the patient reasoning of someone who had learned that anger rarely solved problems. Officer Rodriguez exchanged looks with his partner before addressing Rachel. "Ma'am, are you sure you need us here? This doesn't appear to be a security issue." His tone carried a subtle rebuke, suggesting that the call had been unnecessary escalation. Rachel flushed, but doubled down. "He was disrupting the boarding." "A process," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. The contrast between her accusations and Marcus's actual behavior became increasingly stark. Part 7, observers' internal struggle about when to intervene intensifies. James Cooper felt the weight of his CEO position pressing down on him like a physical force. The casual hoodie and jeans he wore for these undercover visits suddenly felt like a costume, one that forced him to watch his company's values crumble in real time. His internal struggle intensified as he weighed the impact of immediate intervention against the value of letting the situation unfold naturally. Through 20 years of building Summit Airlines from a regional carrier to a major player in the industry, Cooper had learned that surface-level changes rarely lasted. Real transformation required understanding the depth of a problem. Yet watching Marcus Sullivan stand there, dignity intact despite the mounting indignities, tested every principle of his observation-first approach. Cooper's mind raced through potential consequences. Revealing himself now would certainly solve Marcus's immediate problem. No gate agent would dare deny boarding to a veteran once they knew the CEO was watching. But would it address the underlying issue? Would it help him understand how many other veterans had faced similar treatment when he wasn't there to intervene? The security officer's presence added another layer of complexity to his decision. Officer Rodriguez, with his own military pin catching the morning light, seemed to understand the situation better than Cooper's own employee. The CEO watched as Rodriguez positioned himself slightly closer to Marcus than to Rachel, a subtle but clear indication of where his sympathies lay. "Sir," Cooper heard himself say, still maintaining his role as a concerned passenger, "maybe I could help." He stepped forward, mind already forming plans for how to resolve this without revealing his identity. "I'm happy to take a later flight, if that would help accommodate Mr. Sullivan." Rachel's response cut through his offer. "That won't be necessary. As I've explained, this is a matter of aircraft change and capacity. Her fingers moved across her keyboard, deliberately turning the screen away from view. A movement Cooper recognized as hiding the volunteer compensation system he'd had, installed specifically for situations like this. In his pocket, Cooper's phone felt heavy with potential. One quick email to operations could solve this. One phone call to his executive team could have Rachel removed from her position. One swipe to display his company ID could end this immediately. But would that solve the real problem? He thought back to the day he'd founded Summit Airlines. His father, a Korean War veteran like Marcus, had faced similar treatment at another airline. That experience had driven Cooper to build something different, an airline that prided itself on respect, dignity, and service. Now, watching Marcus stand there with his medals and memories, Cooper saw his father's ghost in every line of the veteran's face. The young soldier in fatigues had moved closer, his own internal struggle visible as he debated whether to speak up. Cooper recognized in him the same conflict he felt, the desire to act warring with respect for proper channels and procedures. The solidarity between service members, past and present, stood in stark contrast to Rachel's bureaucratic coldness. A flight attendant approached the gate, preparation papers in hand for the upcoming boarding. Cooper recognized her. Sarah Chen, a 15-year veteran of Summit Airlines known for her exceptional customer service. Her eyes took in the scene, lingering on Marcus's Marine Corps pin and the security officer's presence. Cooper watched, her expression shift from professional neutrality to concern. The CEO's hands clenched involuntarily as Rachel began preparing boarding announcements, clearly intent on proceeding as if Marcus's situation had been resolved. Cooper knew the next few minutes would be critical. Once boarding began, the momentum of airport operations would make it even harder to address the injustice unfolding before him. His company's motto, "Rising Above," mocked him from the gate display screen. They weren't rising above anything at the moment. Instead, they were falling into the same patterns of bureaucratic indifference that he'd founded Summit Airlines to combat. Part 8. Bystanders' mixed reactions to the situation. The gate area had transformed into an impromptu theater, with Marcus, Sullivan's dignified stance at center stage, and an audience of travelers whose reactions painted a complex portrait of modern society's relationship with its veterans. The morning sun streaming through the terminal windows cast both light and shadows across the gathered faces, each expressing their own response to the unfolding drama. Near the front of the boarding line, a middle-aged woman in business attire checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes. "They need to just start boarding," she muttered to her colleague. "We can't all be late because of one person." Her words carried just far enough to draw disapproving glances from several nearby passengers. In contrast, an elderly gentleman with a Korean War veteran's cap rose slowly from his seat in the waiting area. Leaning on his wife's arm for support, he made his way toward Marcus. "Marine," he called out, his voice wavering but determined. "I'm on this flight. You can have my seat." His wife nodded in agreement, her eyes bright with emotion. Rachel quickly intervened. "Sir, seat transfers aren't permitted for security reasons," she announced, her tone suggesting she'd invented the policy on the spot. The elderly veteran's offer hung in the air, a moment of genuine solidarity thwarted by bureaucratic obstruction. A young mother trying to manage two small children paused in her struggles with their backpacks. "Mommy?" her daughter asked loudly, pointing at Marcus's medals. "Why is that man standing there? Did he do something wrong?" The mother's face flushed as she tried to explain in whispers, her own discomfort with the situation evident. The young soldier in fatigues, who had been watching everything unfold, finally stepped forward. "Ma'am," he addressed Rachel directly, his voice carrying the weight of active service, "I'm on this flight as well. I'd be honored to give up my seat for Mr. Sullivan." His posture mirrored Marcus's military bearing, creating a visual bridge across generations of service. James Cooper, still maintaining his undercover position, watched as Rachel's response to this second offer carried the same dismissive tone. "As I said, we can't accommodate seat transfers. If everyone could please remain in the boarding line." Dandil. Her attempt to regain control of the situation only highlighted its fundamental unfairness. A group of college students, initially absorbed in their phones, had gradually become invested in the scene. One of them was quietly recording the interaction, while another whispered, "This is going viral for sure. Cisco veterans denied is trending." Their youthful indignation found expression through social media, turning a personal indignity into a potential public relations crisis. At the back of the gathering crowd, a pilot and flight attendant from another airline paused their walk through the terminal. The pilot's face darkened as he overheard Rachel's latest rejection of help. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over his airline's customer service number, clearly contemplating offering Marcus an alternative. An executive type in the priority boarding line cleared his throat loudly. "Look," he announced to no one. "In particular, I'm in first class. Why don't we find a way to make this work? Surely there's some flexibility in the system." His suggestion, though well-intentioned, drew a sharp look from Rachel, who seemed to take it as another challenge to her authority. Through it all, Marcus maintained his dignified stance, the leather briefcase containing his medals held close. Each offer of help was met with a grateful nod, each rejection with stoic acceptance. His presence served as a mirror, reflecting back to each observer their own values and prejudices. Part 9. Heightening of tension through continued mistreatment. Rachel's voice cut through the mounting tension like a cold blade. Final boarding call for Summit Airlines Flight 2241 to Washington, D.C. will begin momentarily. She emphasized each word with mechanical precision, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Marcus while starting to organize her boarding passes. "Priority boarding passengers may now approach the gate," she announced, her tone carrying an edge of triumph. The implied message was clear. The matter of Marcus Sullivan's seat was considered closed, regardless of the offers of help from other passengers or the obvious injustice of the situation. Security Officer Rodriguez hadn't moved from his position near Marcus, his own military background creating an unspoken bond with the veteran. He watched Rachel with narrowed eyes, his experience telling him this situation was far from resolved. "Ma'am," he tried once more, "are you certain there's no way to review the passenger manifest again?" Rachel's response came with rehearsed efficiency. "As I've explained multiple times, this is an internal airline matter. Security's presence is no longer required." She gestured toward the growing priority boarding line. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flight to board." The flight attendant, Sarah Chen, who'd been observing the situation, stepped closer to her colleague behind the counter. "Rachel," she whispered, though her voice carried to those nearby, "maybe we should check with operations. This doesn't feel right." The concern in her voice reflected years of customer service experience and genuine empathy for the situation. Rachel turned to Sarah, her whispered response sharp enough to make several nearby passengers wince. "Stay out of this. I've made my decision, and I don't need anyone undermining my authority." The words carried the bitter edge of someone more concerned with power than service. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, the morning's long stand taking its toll on his injured leg. The movement was subtle, but it caught James Cooper's attention. The CEO watched as the veteran's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his cane, the only visible sign of discomfort he'd shown throughout the ordeal. "First-class passengers, please have your boarding passes ready," Rachel called out, her voice carrying artificial cheerfulness. She began processing the priority passengers, each scan of a boarding pass serving as another dismissal of Marcus's situation. A well-dressed woman in the first-class line hesitated as she reached the counter, looking back at Marcus. "This isn't a right," she said, loud enough for others to hear. "I travel first class regularly, and I know there are usually empty seats." Rachel's response was to thrust the woman's boarding pass back at her with more force than necessary. The young soldier in fatigues had moved to stand near Marcus, creating an informal honor guard. His presence seemed to inspire others. The elderly Korean war veteran and his wife remained nearby, while the college students had stopped pretending to be absorbed in their phones, their young faces reflecting growing indignation. James Cooper felt the situation approaching a breaking point. Rachel's escalating hostility, the growing crowd of concerned passengers, and Marcus's quiet dignity were creating a powder keg of tension. The CEO knew from experience that moments like these defined a company's true character. Not the policies, written in boardrooms, but the actual treatment of people in moments of crisis. Part 10. First subtle intervention by disguised observer. James Cooper stepped forward, his casual attire still masking his authority, but his stance shifting subtly to reflect years of executive presence. "Excuse me," he addressed Rachel, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone used to being heard. "I believe I overheard earlier that this flight had an aircraft change. Could you explain the exact impact on seating?" The question, precise and technical, caught Rachel off guard. Her fingers froze over the keyboard as she processed the unexpected inquiry. "Sir, as I've said, the details of our seating arrangements are internal matters." Cooper maintained his role as a concerned passenger, but pressed further. "I understand that, but federal regulations require transparency about aircraft changes that affect confirmed reservations. Wouldn't that apply here?" His knowledge of airline protocols, carefully masked as casual observation, made Rachel's expression flicker with uncertainty. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting shorter shadows across the gate area. Cooper positioned himself so that the light fell directly on Rachel's computer screen, making it harder for her to hide the booking system's display. "For instance," he continued, "I believe DOT guidelines specify that previously confirmed passengers must be accommodated before any standby assignments are processed." Rachel's professional mask slipped slightly. "Are you with the FAA?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. The question drew attention from nearby passengers, several of whom had paused their boarding preparations to listen. "Just a frequent flyer who pays attention," Cooper replied smoothly. "And someone who believes that the way we treat our veterans reflects on all of us." He gestured toward Marcus, who watched the exchange with quiet interest. "Mr. Sullivan had a confirmed reservation, didn't he?" The flight attendant, Sarah Chen, moved closer to the counter, her own professional experience adding weight to Cooper's questions. "Rachel," she said quietly, "he's right about the DOT. Guidelines, maybe we should double-check the manifest." Cooper noticed Rachel's slight hesitation, a crack in her previously impenetrable wall of bureaucratic resistance. He pressed his advantage gently. "I'm particularly interested in how an aircraft change could result in the loss of a specifically assigned seat. That's not typically how reconfigurations work, is it?" Security Officer Rodriguez, still nearby, nodded almost imperceptibly. His own experience with airline protocols aligned with Cooper's carefully posed questions. The other passengers in line had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "Our system shows the seat was reassigned," Rachel insisted, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I don't have to explain our internal procedures to passengers." "Actually," Cooper responded, his tone remaining conversational but carrying an undertone of authority, "transparency in booking and seating changes is part of your airline's published customer service commitment. I have a copy right here." He pulled out his phone, where the document was already loaded, not that Rachel needed to know he'd written it himself. The growing crowd of observers had created an impromptu audience for this subtle battle of knowledge versus obstruction. The young soldier in fatigues listened intently, recognizing in Cooper's measured approach the kind of tactical precision taught in military training. "Perhaps," Cooper suggested, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach the gathered passengers, "we could review the original booking confirmation. Federal law requires airlines to maintain records of such changes." The reference to legal requirements made Rachel's confident facade crack further. Part 11. Discovery of significant item information that changes perspective. The pivotal moment came when Marcus's briefcase slipped slightly from his grip, falling open just enough for something to catch the morning light. A medallion rolled across the polished airport floor, its golden surface gleaming as it spun to a stop near Rachel's counter. James Cooper moved quickly to retrieve it, but as he reached for the medal, his breath caught in his throat. The inscription on its surface was unmistakable. The Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors a military unit could receive. But it wasn't just any unit award. It was from a specific campaign that Cooper knew intimately through his father's stories. "Sierra Valley, 1968, Cooper read quietly, his fingers tracing the engraved letters. The gate area had gone silent, the usual airport chaos muted by the gravity of the moment. Marcus stepped forward, his movement betraying a slight urgency that his military bearing hadn't shown before. "Careful with that, son," Marcus said softly. 17 men earned that citation. Only 3 of us are left to tell their story." His voice carried the weight of half a century of memories, each word measured against the cost of the honor he'd just revealed. Rachel, still behind her counter, couldn't help but lean forward to see what had caused such a reaction. The medals. Significance might have been lost on her, but the reverent way Cooper held it spoke volumes. "The Sierra Valley campaign," Cooper said, his voice thick with recognition. "The rescue mission that saved an entire firebase." He looked up at Marcus, seeing him with new eyes. "You were there, weren't you? With the 3rd Marine Division?" Marcus nodded slowly, his usual stoic expression softening slightly. "2nd Platoon, Charlie Company. But how would you know about that? It's not exactly common knowledge." Cooper's hand trembled slightly as he held the medal. "My father. He was at Firebase Echo. He used to tell me stories about the unit that fought through 3 days of enemy fire to reach them, said he owed his life to those Marines." The revelation rippled through the gathered crowd. The young soldier in fatigues straightened even more, recognizing the significance of what he was witnessing. The elderly Korean War veteran who had offered his seat earlier wiped his eyes quietly. Rachel's expression shifted as she watched the interaction, her bureaucratic shield cracking further. The cold statistics on her computer screen seemed suddenly inadequate against the weight of the history literally rolling across her floor. "We lost good men getting to that fire base," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came only from lived experience. "Your father's unit had been cut off, surrounded. The brass said it was too risky to attempt a rescue." He paused, his hand tightening slightly on his cane. "But we had a saying in the Marines, we leave no one behind." Cooper carefully picked up another medal that had fallen from the briefcase, the Silver Star. Its surface was worn smooth in places, testament to years of handling. "This was from the same operation, wasn't it?" Marcus nodded. "Given to our platoon leader, Lieutenant James Morrison. He didn't make it back. His grandson is supposed to receive it at tonight's ceremony." The weight of that responsibility hung heavy in his words. Sarah Chen, the flight attendant, had moved closer, her professional demeanor softened by the unfolding story. She stared at the medals with a mixture of awe and dawning comprehension about exactly what kind of man they had been refusing to board. Part 12. Introduction of historical context through memory, flashback. As Marcus carefully gathered his medals, The morning sunlight catching their worn surfaces, his voice took on a distant quality. "Firebase Echo," he began, his eyes focusing on something far beyond the airport terminal walls. It was the monsoon season. 3 days of rain so heavy you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. But we could hear them, the firebase taking heavy fire. Cooper listened intently, each word resonating with the stories his father had shared over the years. The gate area had grown extraordinarily quiet, even the usual airport announcements seeming to fade into the background as Marcus continued his story. "We were 26 men when we started out," Marcus said, his voice steady but weighted with memory. "The enemy had the high ground, every approach covered. Command said it was suicide to attempt a rescue, ordered us to hold position." He paused, his hand unconsciously touching the Marine Corps pin on his lapel. "Lieutenant Morrison gathered us together, said he wouldn't order anyone to go. Every single Marine stepped forward. The young soldier in fatigues moved closer, drawn by the kind of war story that never made it into training manuals. Rachel, despite her earlier hostility, found herself leaning forward over her counter, her boarding announcements temporarily forgotten. The first day, we lost 4 men crossing the river valley. The enemy had it zeroed, mortars, machine guns. Tommy Rodriguez, just 19 years old, used himself as a decoy to draw fire so we could locate their positions. Marcus's voice caught slightly. His brother's supposed to be at tonight's ceremony. First time anyone from his family will hear the full story. James Cooper thought of his father's perspective from inside Firebase Echo, the desperate wait for rescue while ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. The stories merged now, 2 sides of the same brutal chapter of history. "Second day was worse," Marcus continued. "The rain had turned everything to mud. Couldn't call in air support. Ceiling was too low. We were running low on everything. Ammo, medical supplies, water. Lost 3 more men to an ambush in a bamboo grove. Lieutenant Morrison got hit but kept leading, kept pushing us forward." Security Officer Rodriguez had removed his cap, holding it respectfully against his chest. The elderly Korean War veteran nodded slowly, recognition of shared experience transcending the decades between their services. The third day. Marcus paused, his grip tightening on his cane. We could see the firebase, or what was left of it. Enemy had it surrounded, were preparing for a final assault. Lieutenant Morrison knew we had one chance. He divided us into 3 groups, one to provide covering fire, one to flank their positions, and one to break through to the firebase. Cooper could almost hear his father's voice overlapping with Marcus's, describing the moment when the Marines appeared through the rain and smoke, charging the enemy positions with a fury that turned the tide of the battle. "Morrison led the breakthrough himself," Marcus said quietly. "Got hit 3 times crossing that last 100 yards, but he kept going. His actions inspired the rest of us. We hit them so hard they thought a full company was attacking. By the time it was over, we'd lost 11 men, but we'd saved 38 in that firebase." The gate area remained hushed, the usual bustle of airport life suspended in the gravity of Marcus's remembrance. Sarah Chen wiped a tear from her cheek, while several passengers who had been complaining about the delay now stood in respectful silence. Part 13, Revelation of Unexpected Connection Between Characters. Cooper's hand moved to his jacket pocket, withdrawing an old, worn photograph. He'd carried it for years, a reminder of why he'd built Summit Airlines with such emphasis on respect and dignity. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "I believe you might recognize someone in this picture." The photograph, creased and faded with age, showed a group of Marines gathered around a battered flagpole. Despite the mud and exhaustion evident on their faces, each man stood proud, the aftermath of Firebase Echo's rescue captured in a single moment. Marcus adjusted his glasses, leaning forward slightly to study the image. His breath caught audibly. "Where did you get this?" His finger traced across the faces, stopping at a young Marine standing near the center. "That's Morrison before he—" He paused, then moved to another figure. "And that's me, though I had a lot more hair back then." "The man on the far right," Cooper said softly, "the one being supported by two others. That's my father, Thomas Cooper. He was the communications officer at Firebase Echo. He took shrapnel protecting the radio, kept it working long enough to coordinate with your rescue force." Rachel, who had been listening intently, moved from behind her counter, for the first time drawn by the history unfolding before her. The photograph passed through reverent hands. The young soldier, Officer Rodriguez, the elderly Korean War veteran, each understanding the weight of what they were holding. "Your father," Marcus said slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "He's the one who jury-rigged the radio antenna using parts from a broken Jeep. Without that signal, we would never have found the firebase in that weather." He looked at Cooper with new understanding. "He saved as many lives that day as any of us who fought our way in." Cooper nodded, emotions threatening to break through. His carefully maintained cover. "He passed away 5 years ago," he said quietly, "but he never forgot what your unit did. He made sure I understood the cost of the freedom we enjoy, the debt we owe to men like you and Lieutenant Morrison." The revelation rippled through the gathered crowd. Sarah Chen, the flight attendant, stepped forward. "Mr. Sullivan, this ceremony tonight, it's not just about medals, is it? It's about keeping promises, preserving memories." Marcus straightened, his military bearing more pronounced. "Lieutenant Morrison made us promise before he died that we'd make sure the families knew not just how their loved ones died, but how they lived, how they fought, how they saved others. Tonight's ceremony—" He paused, composing himself. "Tonight is our last chance to fulfill that promise. Most of us are too old or too ill to travel anymore." Rachel stood frozen behind her counter, the computer screen displaying seat assignments suddenly seeming trivial against the weight of the history and promises she'd been trying to dismiss. The young college students who had been recording earlier lowered their phones, recognizing that some moments deserved more respect than social media coverage. Part 14. Moment of Truth, Identity Reveal. James Cooper straightened to his full height, the casual demeanor of an ordinary passenger falling. Away like a shed coat, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the stance of someone used to commanding boardrooms rather than requesting favors. "Ms. Martinez," he addressed Rachel, using her full name for the first time, "I believe it's time we cleared up this seating situation." His voice had changed, taking on an authority that made several nearby airline employees snap to attention instinctively. Rachel's expression shifted from confusion to concern as Cooper reached into his back pocket and withdrew his company ID. "My name is James Cooper, CEO of Summit Airlines." He held up the identification card, its golden logo catching the morning light. "And I believe we need to have a serious discussion about our company's values." The effect was immediate. Rachel's face drained of color, her hands frozen over her keyboard. Sarah Chen, the flight attendant, pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes widening in recognition. The gathered crowd murmured in surprise, several passengers pulling out phones to capture the moment. "Sir, I didn't—" Rachel stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. "If I had known—" Cooper raised his hand, cutting off her protest. "That's precisely the problem, isn't it? Our treatment of passengers shouldn't depend on whether or not the CEO is watching." His voice carried through the gate area, clear and firm. "It shouldn't take a corporate title to ensure we treat a decorated veteran with the respect he deserves." Marcus Sullivan remained steady, his military bearing unchanged by the revelation. If anything, a slight smile touched his lips, the kind of smile that suggested he'd seen enough of life to appreciate its unexpected turns. "Mr. Cooper," Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. "I served 4 years in the Marines myself. What your airline did here today," he glanced at Marcus, then back at Cooper, "it's not just about one seat on one flight. It's about how we honor our promises as a nation." Cooper nodded gravely. "I couldn't agree more, officer." He turned to address the gathered crowd. "My father was saved by Mr. Sullivan's unit at Firebase Echo. When I founded this airline, I named it Summit because I believed we could rise above the ordinary, treat people with the dignity they deserve." His gaze settled on Rachel. "Today, we failed that mission." Sarah Chen moved to stand beside Cooper. "Sir, I've been with Summit for 15 years. This isn't who we are. This isn't what we stand for." Her voice carried the conviction of someone who had lived the company's values through countless flights and customer interactions. The young soldier in fatigues cleared his throat. "Sir, if I may." Cooper nodded, and the soldier continued. "In the military, we have a saying, leadership flows from the top, but character shows in the trenches. Today showed us both the best and worst of what people can be." Part 15, Authority Figures' Realization of Mistake. Rachel Martinez's transformation from authoritative gate agent to humbled employee unfolded in painful clarity beneath the terminal's fluorescent lights. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked between her CEO and the veteran she'd dismissed so callously. "Mr. Cooper, I can explain," she began, but stopped as she realized every justification she might offer would only highlight the magnitude of her failure. The boarding passes in her hands suddenly felt like evidence of her misplaced priorities. Cooper moved closer to the counter, his voice low but carrying the weight of 2 decades of leadership. "Rachel, when I started this airline, I sat in this very terminal, watching how other companies treated their passengers. I saw countless veterans like Mr. Sullivan being overlooked, dismissed, treated as inconveniences rather than heroes. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the gate area. Through the large windows, a Summit Airlines plane taxied past, its livery bearing the company motto, "Rising Above." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. "I've pulled up your actions in the system," Cooper continued, glancing at her computer screen. "You had multiple options available. 3 first-class seats were being held for last-minute sales. The volunteer compensation system was active. You could have requested assistance from other flights." Each point landed like a gentle but firm hammer blow. Rachel's face flushed deeper with each revelation. "I thought I was following protocol," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "The system showed his seat was reassigned." "By you," Cooper finished quietly. "The logs show you manually reassigned his seat 20 minutes before he approached the counter. Why?" The question hung in the air as Rachel struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound as hollow as it felt. The young college students who had been recording earlier lowered their phones, sensing that this moment of realization deserved privacy rather than viral infamy. I saw his age, saw that he might need assistance boarding," Rachel finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "I thought it would be easier to rebook him on a later flight than deal with potential delays." As she spoke the words aloud, their inadequacy struck her fully. Marcus, who had remained dignified throughout, stepped forward. "Young lady," he said, his voice carrying neither anger nor accusation, "in Vietnam, we learned that the easy path and the right path rarely run parallel. The measure of a person isn't in how they handle convenience, but in how they face challenges." Sarah Chen, the flight attendant, placed a gentle hand on Rachel's shoulder. "We all make mistakes," she said softly, "but it's what we learn from them that defines us." Cooper watched the interaction carefully, noting the genuine shame in Rachel's expression. This wasn't the practiced contrition of someone caught by a superior, but the real understanding of how her actions had affected another human being. Part 16. Intimate conversation scene, revealing deeper layers. Cooper gestured toward two empty seats near the gate. "Mr. Sullivan, could we talk for a moment?" The CEO's casual attire now seemed to carry a different purpose, not just for undercover observation, but as a reminder that some conversations needed to happen on equal ground. Marcus nodded, easing himself into one of the seats, while Cooper took the other. The morning bustle of the airport continued around them, but their corner had become a quiet island of understanding. The leather briefcase with its precious cargo of medals rested between them. "My father never talked much about Firebase Echo," Cooper began, his voice low enough for only Marcus to hear. "Not until near the end, but in his final days he couldn't stop talking about the Marines who fought their way through hell to reach them. He said he heard your battle cry before he saw you, Semper Fi, cutting through the rain and gunfire." Marcus's weathered hands rested on his cane, his eyes distant with memory. "We were so focused on reaching the firebase, we didn't think about what came after. Didn't know we'd carry those days with us for the rest of our lives." He paused, looking directly at Cooper. "Your father, he was the one who kept playing that Johnny Cash song over the radio, wasn't he? To let us know they were still fighting." Cooper smiled, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. "Ring of Fire." He said it seemed appropriate, given the situation. Said it also helped him keep the wounded men conscious, gave them something to focus on besides the pain. "Lieutenant Morrison loved that song," Marcus said softly. "He was humming it when—" He stopped, the weight of unspoken memories hanging between them. "Your father was a brave man, son. He kept that radio working despite his wounds, kept us updated on enemy positions. Without him, we might have lost more men finding our way in." The gate area had grown quieter, as if the airport itself was paying respect to the conversation. Rachel, still at her counter, watched with a growing understanding of what her bureaucratic dismissal had nearly prevented. Not just a veteran missing a flight, but the loss of irreplaceable moments of shared history. "There's something else," Cooper said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small, tarnished compass. "My father wanted me to return this if I ever met anyone from 2nd Platoon. Said a Marine gave it to him when he was wounded, told him to use it to point the way home if the radio failed." Marcus stared at the compass, recognition flooding his face. "John Murphy's compass," he said quietly. "He always said it was his good luck charm, never went on a mission without it. He gave it to your father?" Cooper nodded. "Dad said Murphy told him, 'Keep it pointing true, radio man. We're coming for you.' He never knew if Murphy made it out." "He didn't," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Caught a sniper's bullet covering our final approach to the firebase. Saved 3 men with his last action, drawing fire so they could reach cover." He reached for the compass with slightly trembling hands. "His name's on the wall in D.C. I visit him every chance I get." Part 17. Personal history reveal that explains character's importance. "There's something I've never told anyone about Firebase Echo," Marcus said, turning Murphy's compass over in his hands. The morning sun caught its scratched surface, highlighting years of wear from jungle humidity and countless missions. "Something your father might not have known about that final approach." Cooper leaned forward, sensing the weight of what was about to be shared. Around them, the airport's usual chaos seemed to fade into the background, as if the space itself was making room for this piece of history. "We were down to 17 men when we made that final push," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the quiet intensity of long-buried memories surfacing. "Lieutenant Morrison was already wounded twice, but he wouldn't stop. We'd lost communication with the firebase. Enemy fire had finally taken out their antenna. We didn't even know if anyone was still alive in there," Rachel had moved closer, her earlier bureaucratic armor completely shed, replaced by an attentive reverence. The young soldier in fatigue stood nearby, understanding he was witnessing the kind of oral history that rarely made it into official records. Your father's radio broadcasts had stopped about an hour earlier, Marcus explained, looking at Cooper. The silence was deafening. Morrison gathered us together behind a ridge line. Said he wouldn't order anyone to make that final run. It looked like straight suicide. The enemy had every approach covered, and we were running on empty. Marcus's hand tightened around the compass. That's when Murphy stepped forward. He'd been our point man, best scout in the unit. He pulled out this compass and said something I'll never forget. Sir, as long as this point's true, we're honor-bound to follow it. Those men in there are counting on us. Cooper could almost see it. 17 exhausted Marines, soaked to the bone, ammunition running low, facing what seemed like impossible odds. His father had described the firebase's situation. Wounded men trying to hold off waves of enemy attacks, running out of everything except courage and determination. Morrison looked at that compass, then at each of us. Marcus continued. He said, 3 teams. Murphy, take point with first team, draw their fire. Sullivan, you're with second team. Hit their flank when they're distracted. I'll lead third team straight up the middle once you've got them confused. The elderly Korean war veteran who had been listening nearby nodded slowly, recognizing the tactical thinking born of desperate circumstances. Officer Rodriguez stood at parade rest, absorbing every detail. Murphy did more than draw their fire, Marcus said, his voice catching slightly. He orchestrated a one-man assault that made them think a whole company was hitting their left flank. We could hear him moving through their positions, laying down fire, throwing his last grenades. He kept them so focused on him that Morrison's team punched straight through their lines. Cooper remembered his father's perspective, the sudden explosion of gunfire from outside the perimeter, the confusion in the enemy ranks, and then the unforgettable sight of Marines charging through the smoke and rain. Part 18. Emotional bond formation between main characters. When we finally breached the firebase perimeter, Marcus continued, still holding Murphy's compass, your father was the first person we found. Despite his wounds, he'd dragged himself to the main bunker, keeping that radio going until the very end. The memory painted itself across his weathered features, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Cooper reached into his pocket and pulled out something else, a tattered piece of paper, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. Dad left me this, he said quietly. His last letter. He wrote it the night before he passed, but made me promise not to read it until I'd met someone from 2nd Platoon. I think now's the time. The gate area had grown extraordinarily still. Even Rachel, who had caused all this with her earlier dismissal, stood transfixed as Cooper carefully opened the sealed letter. The paper crackled softly, its age showing in its yellowed edges. Son, Cooper began reading, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in his eyes. If you're reading this, you've finally met one of them. One of the Marines who refused to let us die that day in Sierra Valley. There's something they need to know, something I never got to tell them. Marcus sat perfectly still, his military bearing maintaining composure even as his eyes reflected decades of carried weight. The compass in his hand caught the morning, light casting small reflections on the terminal ceiling. The night before they reached us, Cooper continued reading, we had 18 wounded men in the bunker, no more morphine, running low on bandages. The enemy was getting closer, and we knew we wouldn't survive another dawn. That's when I made a promise to God. If by some miracle we survived, I'd make sure the men who saved us were never forgotten. Sarah Chen wiped a tear from her cheek as she listened. The young soldier in fatigue stood straighter, recognizing in this story the kind of brotherhood that training courses tried to teach, but could never fully capture. The Marines who fought their way to us didn't just save lives that day. Cooper's voice grew stronger as he read. They showed us what it means to keep faith with your brothers, to honor your promises, no matter the cost. Sullivan, if he's still alive, needs to know something. The medal they gave him for that day doesn't tell the whole story. Marcus looked up sharply at this, his hand tightening on his cane. Cooper continued reading. I saw him through the rain and smoke, carrying 2 wounded men while still returning. Fire! He'd been hit himself. I could see the blood on his uniform, but he wouldn't stop. When they finally reached the bunker, he turned right around and went back out for more. The letter trembled slightly in Cooper's hands. Tell him that every breath I've taken since that day, every moment I've had with my family, every sunrise, I've seen, it's all because of men like him, who put others before themselves. Tell him that his example shaped how I raised you, son. Tell him that his courage didn't end in that valley. It lived on in every life he saved. Part 19. Immediate solution to initial problem. Cooper folded his father's letter carefully, returning it to its protective sleeve before rising from his seat with newfound purpose. The transformation in his demeanor was complete, from undercover observer to airline CEO, taking decisive action. Rachel, he called, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to making million-dollar decisions. Please come here. The gate agent approached slowly, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine contrition. Sir, she began, but Cooper raised his hand gently. This isn't about reprimands right now, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. This is about doing what's right. Pull up the manifest for this flight. Rachel hurried back to her computer, fingers moving across the keyboard with nervous energy. First, Cooper announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, Mr. Sullivan will be taking my personal first-class seat. Sarah, he turned to the flight attendant, please ensure he's comfortable and has everything he needs for the flight. Marcus started to protest, but Cooper continued, Additionally, I want Lieutenant Morrison's grandson, who's meeting Mr. Sullivan in D.C., upgraded to first class as well. He should be there to receive his grandfather's medal in person, not waiting at the airport. Yes, sir, Sarah responded, already moving to make the arrangements. I'll personally see to it. Cooper turned to address the gathered crowd. To those of you who offered your seats to Mr. Sullivan, your kindness won't go unnoticed. Summit Airlines will be providing each of you with upgrade vouchers for your next flight. The announcement drew appreciative murmurs from those who had volunteered. Rachel's hands shook slightly as she processed the changes. Mr. Cooper, I've updated the manifest. Mr. Sullivan is now in 1A, and I've flagged Lieutenant Morrison's grandson for an upgrade at Reagan National. The young soldier in fatigues stepped forward. Sir, permission to escort Mr. Sullivan to his seat when boarding begins? It would be an honor. Cooper nodded, recognizing the importance of such gestures between service members. Marcus stood slowly, his dignity unchanged by the sudden shift in circumstances. This isn't necessary, he began, but Cooper interrupted gently. Mr. Sullivan, my father taught me that necessary and right aren't always the same thing. This isn't about airline policies or seat assignments anymore. This is about honoring promises, yours to your fallen comrades, my father's to you, and mine to both of your legacies. Sarah returned with boarding passes in hand. Mr. Sullivan, we're ready, whenever you are. We've arranged for early boarding, so you'll have time to get settled. Her tone carried the warmth and respect that should have been there from the beginning. Part 20. Development of larger-scale solution. Cooper turned to address his gathered employees, his voice carrying the weight of imminent change. What happened here today has shown us a gap between who we claim to be as an airline and who we actually are. That changes now. He pulled out his phone, quickly typing out an email. To his executive team, Effective immediately, he announced, Summit Airlines is launching the Echo Initiative, named after Firebase Echo and every veteran who's fought to protect others. The terminal's morning light seemed to intensify as he spoke, casting long shadows behind the assembled crowd. "Sarah," he addressed the flight attendant, "I want you to head up our new Veterans Services Division. Your understanding of both airline operations and customer care makes you perfect for this role." Sarah's eyes widened at the unexpected promotion, but she nodded firmly, already understanding the responsibility she was being given. Rachel watched from behind her counter, witnessing the transformation of a corporate policy into something deeply personal. Cooper continued, his voice growing stronger with each point. "First, every Summit Airlines terminal will have a dedicated Veterans Liaison Officer, someone trained specifically to assist service members and their families. These positions will be filled preferentially by veterans themselves." The young soldier in fatigues nodded approvingly, recognizing the value of having someone who understood military service handling these situations. "Second, we're establishing a permanent upgrade program for veterans traveling to memorial services, award ceremonies, or medical treatments. No veteran should ever have to fight for a seat when they're honoring their fallen comrades or seeking care." Marcus listened quietly, his expression thoughtful as Cooper outlined changes that would affect thousands of future veterans. The CEO's voice carried the same determination that had once echoed through the rain-soaked valleys of Vietnam. "Third, we're creating a training program for all Summit employees, focusing on military service recognition and support. This won't be just another corporate video. We'll have veterans like Mr. Sullivan sharing their stories, helping our staff understand what service really means." Officer Rodriguez had removed his cap again, holding it respectfully as he listened. The elderly Korean War veteran who had offered his seat earlier wiped his eyes, recognizing that something important was taking shape. "Finally," Cooper said, his voice softening slightly, "we're establishing the Morrison Murphy Memorial Fund. For every veteran we fly, Summit Airlines will contribute to organizations supporting military families and memorial preservation efforts." The gate area had grown completely silent, the usual airport chaos seeming to pause in recognition of the moment's significance. Cooper turned back to Marcus, who stood straight despite his fatigue, the morning's events written in the lines of his face. Part 21, Transformation of Antagonist Through Understanding. Rachel Martinez stepped out from behind her counter, her movements hesitant but determined. The badge that had earlier seemed like a shield of authority now felt heavy with responsibility. She approached Marcus, her professional mask completely gone, replaced by genuine remorse. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "before you board, I need to say something." The morning sun through the terminal windows illuminated the tears in her eyes. "What I did, how I treated you. It wasn't just unprofessional. It was wrong on a human level." Cooper watched silently as Rachel continued, recognizing that this moment of transformation needed to unfold naturally. The gathered crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, witnessing the power of genuine realization and remorse. "My grandfather," Rachel's voice cracked slightly, "he served in Desert Storm. He passed away last year, and one of my biggest regrets is that I never really listened to his stories, never really understood what his service meant." She paused, gathering herself. "Today, watching you share your experiences, hearing about Firebase Echo, about Lieutenant Morrison and Murphy's Compass, it made me realize what I've been missing." Marcus stood quietly, his weathered features softening as he listened. The military bearing remained, but there was understanding in his eyes, the kind that comes from having seen enough of life to know that growth often comes from moments of failure. "When I started this job," Rachel continued. "I thought it was about following procedures, maintaining order. I turned people into numbers on a screen, problems to be managed." She glanced at her computer terminal where the booking system still displayed its cold statistics. "I forgot that behind every reservation there's a person with a story, a purpose, a reason for traveling." Sarah Chen moved closer, placing a supportive hand on Rachel's shoulder. The young soldier in fatigues watched with approval, recognizing the courage it takes to admit mistakes and seek redemption. "Mr. Sullivan, I don't just want to apologize," Rachel said, standing straighter. "I want to learn. I want to be part of making sure no veteran ever experiences what you did today. If Mr. Cooper and Summit Airlines will still have me, I want to be involved in the ECHO initiative, not as a gate agent, but as someone committed to honoring and serving those who served us." Cooper nodded slightly, recognizing that Rachel's transformation was exactly what the initiative needed, not just policy changes, but personal understanding and commitment to change. Rachel reached into her pocket and pulled out her own grandfather's service photo. "I carry this," she said softly, "but until today I didn't really understand what it meant. My grandfather used to say that a uniform isn't just cloth and medals. It's a promise to stand for something bigger than yourself. I failed to honor that promise today, but if you'll let me, I'd like to start making it right." Part 22. Public Recognition Acknowledgement of Protagonist. The gate area had transformed from a scene of conflict into something approaching a ceremony. Cooper stepped forward, his casual attire contrasting with the formality of his next actions. The morning sun, streaming through the terminal windows, created a natural spotlight as he addressed the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried across the gate area, "before we begin boarding, I want you to understand exactly who is flying with us today." He gestured toward Marcus, who stood with quiet dignity, his cane and briefcase of medals beside him. "Sergeant Major Marcus, Sullivan isn't just a veteran who deserves respect. He's a living testament to the highest traditions of military service." Cooper's voice grew stronger with each word. "The medals in his briefcase tell stories of courage that most of us can barely imagine, but it's not the medals that make the man. It's the promises he's kept for over half a century." Rachel, still emotional from her own transformation, had returned to her counter, but now stood at attention, her posture reflecting her new understanding. The young soldier in fatigues had positioned himself near Marcus, creating an impromptu honor guard. Today," Cooper continued, "Sergeant Major Sullivan is traveling to Arlington to fulfill one final promise, to ensure that the sacrifice of his brothers in arms is remembered and honored. Lieutenant Morrison's grandson will receive his grandfather's Silver Star, and thanks to the man standing before us, he'll understand exactly why his grandfather was a hero." Sarah Chen stepped forward, holding something in her hands, a framed certificate she'd quickly created and printed. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice clear and professional, "Summit Airlines would like to present you with our first lifetime honorary captain status. From this day forward, you'll never need to worry about booking flights with us. You'll always have a seat of honor." The gathered passengers broke into spontaneous applause. The elderly Korean War veteran who had offered his seat earlier raised his hand in a crisp salute, which Marcus returned with equal precision. Even the college students who had been recording earlier had lowered their phones, recognizing that some moments deserve to be experienced rather than documented. Furthermore, Cooper announced, Gate B-17 at Denver International Airport will be officially renamed the Firebase Echo Memorial Gate. A plaque will be installed telling the story of the brave men who fought through impossible odds to save their fellow soldiers. Every veteran who passes through this gate will know they stand where heroes have stood, Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, still holding Murphy's compass. "Sir," he addressed Marcus, "would you allow us to create a display case for this compass? It should be here, pointing the way for future generations, reminding them of the true meaning of never leave anyone behind." Part 23. Creation of lasting tribute, change. The transformation of Gate B-17 began almost immediately. Cooper pulled out his phone, sending rapid-fire instructions to his executive team. The terminal's usual announcements were temporarily suspended as workers began carefully removing the old gate signage, preparing for something more meaningful. "The plaque will be here by tomorrow," Cooper explained to Marcus, gesturing toward the wall where the Firebase Echo story would be permanently displayed. But more importantly, what happened here today is going to change how Summit Airlines operates at every gate, in every airport we serve. Sarah Chen was already coordinating with other flight attendants, briefing them on the immediate implementation of the Echo initiative. Her tablet displayed a rapidly growing list of veterans already booked on upcoming flights. Each one would receive the recognition they deserved. "Mr. Sullivan," Cooper continued, his voice carrying the weight of genuine commitment, "I'd like your input on something else. We're commissioning a mural for this gate, something that captures the spirit of Firebase Echo and the men who fought there. Would you help us ensure we get the details right?" Marcus nodded slowly, his hand resting on the briefcase containing the medals. "It should show more than just the combat," he said thoughtfully. "Show the brotherhood, the sacrifice, the moment when Murphy gave your father his compass. Show the rain and the mud, but also the determination in their eyes." Rachel, who had been listening intently, stepped forward with a suggestion that showed how far she'd come in understanding. "What if we included QR codes near the mural? Veterans or family members could scan them to hear recorded stories from survivors, to learn about the men who served there." The young soldier in fatigues added his own perspective, and maybe a section for current service members to leave messages, to show how the legacy of Firebase Echo continues to inspire new generations. Cooper watched as the ideas flowed, transforming a simple gate into a living memorial. Workers were already installing temporary signs, announcing the upcoming changes, and passengers paused to read about the history that had unfolded in this very spot. "There's one more thing," Cooper said, reaching into his briefcase. He withdrew architectural renderings that had been prepared with remarkable speed. "We're creating veterans' lounges in every major hub, not just quiet spaces, but places where service members can connect, share stories, and find the support they need." The renderings showed thoughtfully designed spaces, with walls dedicated to different conflicts, comfortable seating areas for conversations, and special assistance desks staffed by veteran liaisons. But it was the proposed name that caught Marcus's eye: the Morrison Murphy Memorial Lounges. Part 24. Demonstration of Systematic Transformation. The impact of the morning's events rippled through Denver International Airport like waves across still water. Cooper's executive team, responding to his urgent directives, had already begun implementing changes that would reshape Summit Airlines' approach to veteran services. The first Morrison Murphy Memorial Lounge will open here at Gate B-17 within 30 days. Cooper announced, scrolling through real-time updates on his phone, but the changes start today. He turned to Sarah Chen, who was already coordinating with ground crews across the country. "All Summit flights today will begin with a new announcement," Sarah explained, her tablet displaying the carefully crafted words. "We're acknowledging veterans on every flight, offering priority boarding, and ensuring our crew members understand the importance of recognizing service." Rachel, transformed by her experience, had taken immediate action at her own station. The booking system on her screen now displayed a new priority flag for veteran passengers, ensuring they would never again face the dismissal she had earlier shown Marcus. "Mr. Sullivan," Cooper said, gesturing toward the gate area where workers were already preparing for the renovations. "Your experience here today is going to change thousands of lives. Look." He pointed to his phone, where emails were pouring in from Summit Airline staff across the country, responding to the announcement of the Echo initiative. Station managers from Seattle to Miami were sending messages of support, many sharing their own connections to military service. A gate agent in Chicago wrote about her brother serving overseas, while a ground crew chief in Atlanta mentioned his years in the Air Force. "This isn't just policy anymore," Cooper explained, showing Marcus the responses. "It's becoming part of our DNA as a company. Every employee will undergo new training, but more importantly, they'll understand why it matters." The young soldier, in fatigues still standing nearby, watched as a crew began measuring the wall where the Firebase Echo mural would soon be installed. "Sir," he addressed Cooper, "my unit returns from deployment next month. They're flying Summit from Dallas. Will these changes be in place by then?" Cooper nodded firmly. "The Echo initiative goes into effect immediately. Your unit will be among the first to experience the full program." He turned to Sarah, who was already pulling up the Dallas flight manifests. "Make sure they're taken care of every step of the way." Officer Rodriguez, who had been coordinating with airport security, returned with news. "Sir, the airport authority has approved expedited installation of the memorial elements. They're waiving the usual permit waiting periods. Seems your story has touched some hearts in administration." Part 25, Impact Ripple Effect, showing broader change in society. As Marcus Sullivan's flight prepared for its final boarding call, the transformation that had begun at Gate B-17 was already spreading beyond Summit Airlines. Local news crews, alerted by passengers' social media posts, had begun arriving at the terminal, their cameras capturing the installation of the temporary Firebase Echo memorial markers. "Mr. Sullivan," Cooper said, checking his phone one final time, "you should know that what happened here today has already reached Washington. The VA has contacted us about partnering with the Echo initiative, expanding it to include medical transport coordination and family support services." The morning sun had reached its full strength now, streaming through the terminal windows and illuminating the gate area where workers continued their preparations for the permanent memorial. But more striking than the physical changes was the shift in atmosphere. Every Summit Airlines employee moved with new purpose, understanding that their roles carried deeper meaning. "The first class of veteran liaisons will begin training next week," Sarah Chen reported, her tablet displaying a growing list of applicants. "We've already received hundreds of responses from veterans interested in joining the program, including some from Mr. Sullivan's old unit." Rachel, who had transformed from antagonist to advocate, was speaking with other gate agents, her eyes bright with purpose as she explained the importance of the changes they were implementing. Her grandfather's service photo sat prominently on her counter now, a constant reminder of the legacy she had almost dishonored. "Before you board," Cooper addressed Marcus one final time, "there's something else you should know. Summit Airlines will be commissioning a documentary about Firebase Echo, not just about the battle, but about the bonds that survived half a century, about promises kept and honored. We want to ensure these stories are never forgotten." The young soldier in fatigues, who had witnessed everything, stepped forward for a final salute. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "my unit has a saying, today's missions protect tomorrow's freedoms. What you did at Firebase Echo, what you're doing here, today, it's still protecting us, still teaching us what service really means." As Marcus made his way down the jet bridge, supported by the respectful arms of both the young soldier and Sarah Chen, the gathered crowd watched in reverent silence. Cooper stood at the gate entrance, understanding that this was more than a policy change or a PR moment. It was the beginning of a movement that would ripple through the airline industry and beyond. The final boarding call for Flight 2241 to Washington, D.C. echoed through the terminal, but it carried a different weight now. It was no longer just another flight. It was the first mission of the Echo Initiative, carrying not just passengers, but the legacy of heroes who had refused to leave anyone behind. As the plane taxied away from Gate B-17, Cooper watched through the terminal windows, Murphy's compass resting in his hand. The morning sun caught its scratched surface one final time, and for a moment it seemed to point toward something greater than any destination. It pointed toward a future where service was honored, promises were kept, and no veteran ever stood alone. The story of Marcus Sullivan and Firebase Echo would live on, not just in the memorial at Gate B-17 or in the policies of Summit Airlines, but in the hearts of all who understood that sometimes the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the lives they touch and the changes they inspire.